The knife sliced through the air before I even saw it coming. My father's voice, sharp as steel, cutting me open in the middle of our family's Thanksgiving dinner. Archer, hand over the check for Emily's Europe trip, or so help me, we'll cut you off for good. My fork clattered against the plate, gravy splattering like blood. And in that frozen second, I realized the feast we'd shared for 24 years was just a pretty lie masking the real hunger. Their control over my life. Emily's eyes widened across the table, her perfectly manicured nails tapping nervously on her wine glass, but she said nothing, just smiled that porcelain doll smile she'd perfected in her sorority house at UCLA. Mom nodded along, her pearls clicking like handcuffs, as if this was normal, as if demanding I empty my savings for her once-in-a-lifetime backpacking adventure through Paris and Rome was just another family favor. I wanted to scream that those savings were for Lucas and me, for the quiet cabin in the Catskills we dreamed of, where we could finally breathe without the weight of secrets pressing down. But I didn't. Not then. I just nodded, throat burning, and excused myself to the bathroom, where I stared at my reflection in the cracked mirror of our cramped Queens apartment. 24 years old, a barista by day and a graphic designer scraping by on freelance gigs by night. And here I was, still the invisible son in a family that saw me as an ATM with a pulse. Lucas's text buzzed in my pocket. Miss you already, babe. Can't wait for our getaway. And I typed back a lie about traffic, my fingers shaking as I transferred the funds from my nearly maxed out account. That night, as the subway rattled me back to my shoebox studio in Brooklyn, the city lights blurred into a neon smear outside the grimy window. New York had always felt like a promise to me. A sprawling beast that didn't care who you loved, as long as you hustled hard enough to survive it. I'd come out to my parents 3 years ago, over a tense phone call from my freshman dorm at NYU, expecting fireworks but getting only silence and a curt, "We'll pray for you." They'd never disowned me, not outright, but the chill settled in like winter fog off the East River. Dinners became interrogations about finding a nice girl. And Emily, my golden child little sister, floated above it all, untouched by their conditional love. Lucas was the light that pierced it. We met 2 years back at a queer poetry slam in the village. Me nursing a cheap IPA. Him on stage reciting verses about lost boys and stolen kisses that hit me like a freight train. He was a teacher at a charter school in Harlem, all easy smiles and warm brown eyes that crinkled when he laughed, with a fade haircut and tattoos peeking from his button-downs like secrets waiting to be shared. Our first date was falafel from a truck on St. Mark's Place, rain soaking us as we ducked under his umbrella, and by the time we kissed goodnight outside my building, I knew he'd rewrite every doubt I'd carried. Archer, you're not just surviving this city, you're owning it, he'd say, his voice a low rumble that grounded me during late-night design deadlines. We talked futures, him grading papers by the fireplace, me sketching logos with coffee breath, building a life that was ours, not borrowed from anyone else's expectations. That Catskills cabin was our beacon, 2 weeks of unplugging, hiking trails dusted with autumn leaves, making love under star-pricked skies without glancing over our shoulders. I'd scrimped every penny from my gigs, even skipped meals to pad the fund. It was more than money. It was proof we could choose joy. But now, Emily's trip, 3 months of hostels and gelato, funded by my blood and sweat, had gutted it. I crashed through my apartment door, the scent of yesterday's takeout hitting me like regret, and collapsed onto the futon. My phone lit up with Emily's thank you text. You're the best big bro ever. Love you. Can't believe I'm doing this. Followed by a string of heart emojis that felt like barbs. I hurled the phone across the room. It skidded under the couch, buzzing ignored. Lucas showed up an hour later, key I'd given him 6 months ago jingling like a lifeline. He took one look at my red-rimmed eyes and pulled me into his chest, his heartbeat steady against my ear. Talk to me, Arch. What's got you twisted up like this? I spilled it all, the dinner ambush, the transfer, the way my parents had framed it as family duty, while Emily preened like she'd earned a medal. Lucas listened, his hand tracing slow circles on my back, but I saw the flicker in his eyes. Disappointment, not for me, but for us. That's bullshit, he said finally, voice edged with that quiet fire he reserved for injustice. You don't owe them your dreams. We can rebuild the fund. I'll pick up extra tutoring shifts. But even as he said it, the math didn't add up. My freelance pipeline had dried up with the holidays looming, and his school salary barely covered his student loans. We made love that night anyway, slow and desperate, his whispers of "I love you," a bomb on the raw edges. In the dark, tangled in sheets that smelled of him, clean soap and faint cologne, I almost believed we could outrun this. Almost. The betrayal came 2 weeks later, swift as a winter gale. Emily's flight was the next day, and I'd forced a smile through one last family brunch at our local diner, the kind with vinyl booths and bottomless coffee that masked the cracks in everything. Mom chattered about Emily's itinerary, Dad grumbled about gas prices, and I nodded along, my mind on Lucas waiting at home with packed bags for a spontaneous city escape we'd salvaged. Just us, a cheap Airbnb in the Finger Lakes. As we hugged goodbye in the airport chaos, JFK's fluorescent buzz and harried travelers a perfect storm, Emily pulled me aside by the gates. Her eyes, so like mine but softer, untroubled, darted nervously. "Arch, there's something I need to tell you. Mom and Dad, they made me promise not to go unless I agreed to talk to you about fixing things." My stomach dropped. Fixing what? You. The family. She lowered her voice, glancing at our parents schmoozing with a gate agent. "They said if I didn't convince you to see that therapist in Jersey, the one who helps with your confusion, they'd pull my funding. I didn't want to, I swear, but Paris. It's my shot, you know? To get out. Figure out who I am." The words landed like punches. Confusion. Therapist. Her shot bought with my silence. Betrayal bloomed hot and ugly in my chest. Not just from her, but from the web they'd spun, using her dreams as leverage against mine. I wanted to rage, to drag her boarding pass from her bag and tear it to shreds. But the announcement for her flight crackled overhead, and all I could do was whisper, "Go, but don't come back pretending this didn't happen." She boarded with a tear-streaked apology, and I walked out of that terminal a ghost, the holiday crowds parting around me like I was already invisible. The subway ride home was a blur of regret. How had I let it fester this long? How had love for my family twisted into chains? Lucas was at the door when I stumbled in, his face falling at the sight of me. "What happened? You look like hell." I collapsed into his arms, the story tumbling out in sobs. Emily's confession, the parents' ultimatum veiled as concern. He held me through it, his silence heavier than words, until finally, he pulled back, eyes fierce. "That's it, Arch. No more. We're done playing their game." We drove that night, not to the Finger Lakes, but straight to my parents' brownstone in Queens. The city streets were slick with early snow, headlights carving tunnels through the flurries, and Lucas gripped the wheel like an anchor. "You deserve a family that sees you," he said, his free hand squeezing mine. "If they can't, we'll build one." The confrontation erupted in their living room, fairy lights twinkling mockingly on the plastic tree. Dad's face purpled as I laid it bare. The manipulation, the conditional love, Emily's complicity. "We're trying to save you, boy," he bellowed, veins bulging. Mom wept into her handkerchief, murmuring about God's plan. But I saw the fear beneath, fear of losing their perfect narrative. Lucas stood beside me, his presence a shield, voice calm but unyielding. "With all due respect, Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, Archer's not broken. He's the strongest man I know. And I love him, for who he is, not who you want him to be." The room fractured then. Dad stormed out to the garage, Mom retreated to the kitchen, and in the echoing silence, I turned to Lucas, the weight of years sloughing off like old skin. "What now?" I whispered. He smiled, that crinkle-eyed one that had hooked me from the start. "Now, we turn this around. Together." The turning point wasn't dramatic fireworks, but a quiet revolution. I cut ties, not harshly, but firmly, emailing Emily mid-flight with a single line. "Find your own way. I'll find mine." I poured my energy into my designs, landing a gig with a queer-owned startup in Soho that paid enough to restart our savings. Lucas and I volunteered at the poetry slam where we'd met, mentoring kids navigating their own coming-outs, turning our scars into stories that lit up dim rooms. Months later, as spring thawed the parks and cherry blossoms dusted the paths like confetti, Emily returned. Not as the prodigal, but changed. She showed up at my studio unannounced, backpack slung over one shoulder, eyes shadowed from hostels and hard truths. I saw the world, Arch, and it showed me how small we'd made ours. No apologies at first, just a shared falafel lunch where she admitted the therapist ploy had been her breaking point too, pushing her to question the pedestal she'd clung to. Reconciliation came slow, like rain soaking parched earth. Mom sent a card, tentative olive branch, and Dad grumbled a proud of you over an awkward call. It wasn't perfection. Families like ours don't rewrite in a day. But it was human, flawed, forgiving, forward. And us? Lucas and I made it to that Catskills cabin come fall, leaves a riot of red and gold framing the windows. We hiked until our legs ached, cooked esmores over a fire that crackled like laughter, and one evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, he dropped to one knee on the porch, not with a ring, but with a promise. Marry me? Not today, not tomorrow, but when you're ready. Because this us is the life I choose. Tears blurred the vista, but I pulled him up, kissing him under the vast American sky. Yes, 1,000 times. In the end, the trip that nearly broke me became the forge. It stripped away the illusions, leaving room for real love, to bloom wild and unapologetic. New York roared on around us, indifferent and alive, and for the first time, I felt like I belonged in its chaos. Not as the dutiful son, but as Archer, lover, creator, survivor. And damn if that didn't feel like turning the world around.